American power isn't collapsing, it's becoming optional. And when power becomes optional, it stops being power at all. For most of the past 70 years, American dominance didn't depend on constant force. It rested on something far more durable: infrastructure. The dollar anchored global trade. The U.S. Navy secured shipping lanes. American technology set the standards others had to follow. Western alliances enforced shared rules. Sanctions isolated those who refused to comply. These weren't just advantages. They were control mechanisms built directly into the global system. Most analysts still measure China's challenge to American power by military budgets and trade balances, as if global dominance were simply about having more ships or a larger economy. But that framework misses how power actually shifts between great nations. Power doesn't usually transfer through confrontation. It transfers when new systems make the old ones unnecessary. China's strategy isn't to defeat American power directly. It's to build parallel systems that allow countries to function without it. And that shift isn't happening through wars or dramatic announcements. It's happening quietly, through finance, infrastructure, technology, and institutions that most people barely notice. In this video, I'll break down 8 overlapping mechanisms that are slowly making American power optional. Once you see how they connect, the scale of the shift becomes impossible to ignore. The dollar's role as global reserve currency was never about economic efficiency. It was about information and control. When international transactions clear through New York banks, Washington can monitor global financial flows and enforce compliance through access to dollar clearing systems. Countries hold dollar reserves not because the U.S. economy is necessarily the safest, but because oil is priced in dollars, most commodities trade in dollars, and the majority of international debt is denominated in dollars. That creates a structural dependency that translates directly into political leverage. China has spent the past decade building alternatives. The cross-border interbank payment system now processes yuan transactions without touching American financial infrastructure. Bilateral currency swap agreements with dozens of countries allow trade settlement without dollar conversion. The yuan's share of global reserves remains modest, but that misses the point. The system doesn't need to replace the dollar to succeed. It just needs to provide a credible alternative for countries that face sanctions risk or resent dollar surveillance. Once that parallel infrastructure exists, every country calculates differently. The dollar's dominance becomes a choice rather than a necessity, and choices can change when circumstances shift. Once the dollar becomes optional, sanctions stop being automatic, and American power has to be actively enforced again. American naval dominance secured the post-war order by guaranteeing freedom of navigation and protecting Allied shipping. That capability gave Washington leverage over any country dependent on maritime trade, which meant nearly everyone. The U.S. Navy didn't need to blockade ports to influence behavior. The implicit threat that it could do so was often sufficient. That power rested on having more carrier strike groups than the rest of the world combined and maintaining bases that projected force into every critical maritime choke point. China's naval expansion isn't trying to match American carrier capabilities ship for ship. It's creating area denial systems that make American force projection progressively more costly and risky. Long-range anti-ship missiles, quiet diesel submarines, and integrated sensor networks mean U.S. carriers can no longer operate freely near Chinese waters without accepting substantial risk. Simultaneously, China is building a blue water navy designed for presence rather than pitched battle, logistics ships, replenishment vessels, and overseas bases that allow sustained operations in the Indian Ocean and beyond. The message isn't that China can defeat the U.S. Navy in open combat. It's that American naval dominance no longer guarantees the same level of control it once did, particularly in Asia where most global trade now flows. Washington can still sail ships, but it can no longer assume compliance. When American companies set technical standards for telecommunications, computing, and internet protocols, they weren't just creating efficient systems. They were determining what future technologies could do and who would control access to them. Standards create lock-in effects that persist for decades. Once infrastructure is built to certain specifications, switching becomes prohibitively expensive even if better alternatives emerge. This gave American firms, and by extension Washington, enormous leverage over technological development worldwide. China is systematically creating alternative technical ecosystems. Huawei's 5G infrastructure doesn't just compete with Western equipment on price. It embodies different assumptions about network architecture, surveillance capabilities, and control mechanisms. Countries adopting Chinese telecommunications infrastructure aren't just buying cheaper equipment. They're integrating into systems where Chinese firms write the protocols and Chinese engineers provide the updates. The same pattern extends to artificial intelligence frameworks, satellite navigation standards, and digital currency architectures. Each adoption narrows the range of systems a country can later choose without massive retrofit costs. Over time, the global technology landscape fragments into incompatible ecosystems. That fragmentation reduces American firms' ability to set universal standards, which was always the deeper source of their power. Technical dominance becomes regional rather than global, and in Asia, Chinese standards increasingly define what's possible. Standards used to be invisible power. Fragmentation turns that power into geography. American alliances after World War II weren't just military pacts. They were comprehensive frameworks that aligned economic systems, security guarantees, and political institutions. NATO, the US-Japan alliance, and treaty relationships across Asia created a network where member countries adopted compatible military systems, coordinated foreign policies, and defaulted to American leadership on major international questions. That institutional architecture meant Washington rarely needed to exercise direct coercion. Aligned interests were built into the structure of the relationships themselves. China is constructing a different model. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Belt and Road Initiative don't demand the same level of political alignment. They offer infrastructure financing, trade agreements, and security cooperation without requiring recipients to adopt Chinese governance models or coordinate foreign policy positions. This creates a softer form of influence, but one that's harder to counter precisely because it's less demanding. Countries can maintain relationships with both Washington and Beijing without feeling forced to choose. But those dual relationships aren't symmetric. Chinese infrastructure projects create ongoing dependencies through maintenance contracts and operational control. Trade relationships denominated in yuan shift financial exposure toward Beijing. Security cooperation agreements establish precedents for Chinese military presence. The cumulative effect is that countries gradually re-weight their calculations without ever making a formal break with American alliances. The brilliance of the model is that no country ever defects. They simply recalculate. American sanctions derived their power from the dollar's centrality and the depth of U.S. financial markets. Cutting a country off from dollar clearing meant cutting them off from international trade, because most global transactions ultimately flowed through New York. That threat was so severe that it often prevented sanctioned behavior before sanctions were even imposed. Countries self-censored to avoid triggering American financial restrictions, giving Washington tremendous leverage without needing to act. China has been systematically building sanctions-resistant infrastructure for the past 15 years. State-owned banks that can absorb losses from being cut off from Western markets. Alternative payment systems that function when SWIFT access is denied. Trade relationships structured to avoid dollar exposure. Strategic commodity reserves that reduce import dependency. The goal isn't to make Chinese firms immune to sanctions. It's to reduce their effectiveness enough that the threat becomes less credible. Iran and Russia provide proof of concept. Both faced maximum pressure campaigns designed to cripple their economies. Both survived by pivoting toward Chinese markets, using yuan-denominated trade, and accessing Chinese financing that wasn't subject to American restrictions. Their continued function, despite comprehensive sanctions, signals to other countries that American financial dominance has limits. Once that signal is internalized, the deterrent effect of sanctions weakens, and Washington's leverage diminishes even before sanctions are formally imposed. Sanctions still exist. What's disappearing is the fear that once made them effective. American economic power in the 20th century rested substantially on manufacturing dominance. The ability to produce ships, aircraft, electronics, and industrial equipment at scale meant the United States could arm allies, supply markets, and rebuild economies. That production capacity was both a source of wealth and a coercive tool, Countries that wanted access to advanced manufacturing had to maintain good relationships with Washington or its allies. China now produces more ships than the rest of the world combined. It manufactures the majority of solar panels, batteries, and rare earth processing capacity. It dominates global supply chains for electronics, pharmaceuticals, and countless intermediate goods that modern economies require. This isn't just about having factories, it's about controlling the production networks that determine what gets made, where, and at what cost. When Australian coal faced restrictions, Chinese buyers simply sourced elsewhere. When Lithuanian trade was disrupted, supply chains rerouted around it. That flexibility comes from having production capacity so large that markets adjust to Chinese decisions rather than the reverse. The scale creates its own form of leverage. Countries that anger Beijing risk losing market access not just to China, but to the supply chains China controls. Meanwhile, American industrial capacity has atrophied to the point where rebuilding it would take decades and require restructuring the entire economy. Scale doesn't just create efficiency, it creates gravity. Space was once an American domain. Satellite communications, GPS navigation, Earth observation, and deep space exploration were capabilities that existed because Washington invested in them and shared access on American terms. That monopoly translated into both practical advantages and symbolic proof of technological superiority. When countries needed satellite launches or navigation services, they came to the United States or its allies. China has assembled a comprehensive space program faster than any nation in history. The Beidou navigation system provides global coverage independent of American GPS. Chinese launch capabilities now exceed American frequency and are substantially cheaper. The Tiangong space station operates while the International Space Station approaches retirement. Lunar and Mars missions demonstrate deep space capabilities that were exclusively American and Soviet for decades. This isn't just about prestige. Navigation independence means Chinese military systems can't be disrupted by GPS denial. Launch capacity means China can replace satellites faster than adversaries can destroy them. Earth observation capabilities mean Beijing has independent intelligence on global activities. The symbolic impact matters too. Countries watching China's space achievements see a technological peer to the United States, which changes how they weight competing offers and whose technical standards seem more credible. In space, redundancy is power, and China is building more of it. The timeline for when these mechanisms become decisive depends on how you measure power shifts. By some metrics, the transition is already well advanced. China is the largest trading partner for most countries worldwide. Its navy is larger than America's in hull count. Its manufacturing output exceeds that of the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. But other measures show continued American dominance. Military spending, reserve currency status, alliance networks remain stronger. The question is which metrics matter more going forward. What seems clear is that the systems are self-reinforcing once they reach a certain threshold. Countries that have integrated Chinese infrastructure find it progressively more expensive to reverse course. Each additional country that adopts Chinese standards makes those standards more viable for others. Every successful resistance to American sanctions reduces the credible threat that future sanctions pose. The accumulation of small shifts in dozens of countries creates momentum that becomes difficult to arrest even if Washington recognized the pattern earlier. The challenge isn't coming through a single dramatic confrontation where the outcome will be obvious. It's emerging through overlapping processes that each seem manageable individually but combine to reshape the entire strategic environment. By the time the shift is undeniable in traditional metrics, the conditions that produced it will already be deeply embedded. For decades, American power meant you didn't have to think about alternatives. The future may require exactly that. The competition isn't over, but its terms have changed in ways that make 20th century frameworks for understanding American power increasingly inadequate for predicting what comes next.